Hello, and welcome to the Traverse Area District Library's Zoom programming. You can always check out more programs and events at toddle.org/events. We have a lot more coming up in the coming months for the holiday season. Everyone here today participating will be entered into a drawing to win a really cool local dogman t-shirt. So thank you for participating. Today we'll be talking about mysterious creatures of the Midwest. We are going to hold questions until the end, but you can utilize the chat feature as well as questions and answers at any time. So now please welcome author, lecturer, researcher on everything strange and unusual. This gentleman searches out unique, freaky, and bizarre stories. Chad Harris.
About some of the research we do at these places. Heck, I'll even provide you with the directions to these places. But I'm going to leave it up to each and every one of you, whether you're a diehard skeptic or a true believer, to go to these places on your own and determine whether or not you believe the legends are true. But I should warn you, it's much easier watching these places on television than it is visiting. When you're out in the middle of nowhere and you see that shadowy creature lurking from tree to tree, you simply can't turn the channel and move on and forget about it. So with that in mind, let's explore some of the creatures that science says do not exist. Skeptics say they can't exist, yet every year hundreds of people are coming face to face with these unknown monsters. First stop, a creature called the Van Meter Visitor. 5 Nights of Terror, 1903. Van Meter, which is in Iowa, it's about 20 minutes southwest of Des Moines, was terrorized by what the newspapers were calling a monster of awful form, a reign of terror, a winged monster. It all began when an implement dealer was coming home late at night. He saw what appeared to be a weird ball of light over one of the buildings in downtown Van Meter. He slowed down thinking it was a bank robber or a practical joker, only to have the ball of light vanish and then reappear on a building on the other side of the street in a matter of a second. Some say the light flew to the other side. The next day he told his story and no one paid it much mind. That is until that evening, late at night, the doctor was sleeping above his office building when he was awoken in the middle of the night by a light flashing into his office. That was a rarity of those times, so he went over to the window to see what was causing it. And when he looked down onto the main drag of Van Meter, he spotted this creature down there. Said it was about 8 feet tall with giant bat leather-like wings. It had a horn on its head and it was projecting light from that horn. I have to give Dr. Alcott credit. He didn't just look at this thing. He ran outside with his weapon and blasted it 5 different times before he ran inside and waited for the safety of daylight. The next day, the town was split. Half thought a real monster was in town. The other half thought it was a joke, a practical joker or a robber. One of those disbelievers was the bank manager, Mr. Dunn. He thought it was a bank robber. So on the third evening, he left his family at home unprotected, grabbed his shotgun with buckshot in it, headed down to the bank to save the town's money. In the middle of the night, he too saw light flashing inside the bank. Behind the light, he saw the giant bat-like creature. He was so terrified, he shot out the front window of the bank with the shotgun. He then barricaded himself inside. The next morning, he went out expecting to find a carcass, blood, fur, feathers, something. The only thing there were these giant 3-toed prints in the mud, of which it was said he took one, and a plaster cast much like this would have looked. But what happened to it, we don't know. The next several nights, The townsfolk saw this creature and they blasted it with everything they had. By the fifth night, it was believed that it was coming from an old abandoned coal mine on the outskirts of town. Right next door to the coal mine was this brick and tile factory. So all of the workers from the brick and tile factory gathered. And then, just before daybreak, they saw the creature coming back to the old abandoned coal mine, and they started blasting it with everything they had. The newspaper said they shot so many times they could have sunk the Spanish fleet. But whether these people were the worst shots in Iowa, or this thing was impervious to their weapons, because it just descended down into the mine, the abandoned coal mine. And like a great Hollywood cliffhanger, that's where the story ends. The newspapers didn't report what happened. Did they kill it? Was it still there? Did it fly off to become the Mothman of Point Pleasant? You wouldn't know it, but I'm standing right over the entrance of that old mine. History books don't even put how it was filled. No one knows when the mine was covered in or how. But what we do know is that for years after the story faded, people went out to the old brick and tile factory, mostly young people because they thought it was haunted. They would go out there and see shadowy objects in the sky. They would see bricks thrown by some unseen force. And since they had forgotten the legend of the visitor, they blamed it on being haunted. But my favorite part of this story is that the good people of Van Meter, Iowa, every year put together the Van Meter Visitor Festival, where you can go and discover for yourself the locations where they shot at it, see where they tried to capture it. The bad news is we just missed it, the last weekend in September. But the good news is that gives you almost an entire year to get your weapons in order, to get to Van Meter and try to capture this monster. As you saw earlier, I did spend time over in Transylvania hunting for vampire legends and lore. Little did I know if I wanted to see vampires, I should have stayed in my home state of Wisconsin. Well, Mineral Point, that is. Back in the 1980s, Mineral Point was overrun with vampires. It all began late at night, 1984, when this police officer, John Pepper, was patrolling late at night. He happened to pass by the Graceland Cemetery. There, he saw what he reported to be a very tall, very pale, very thin, very ugly vampire, complete with a cape on it. He gave chase to this vampire, where he said it easily flew over a fence and disappeared into the night. Officer Pepper did not want to report this. He knew how it sounded, but he was on duty. He had to make the report. And as you can imagine, media from all over the world descended upon Mineral Point looking for the Mineral Point vampire. Pardon me. It got to be so much that Officer Pepper quit the police force, moved away, and refused to talk about the case ever again. But as soon as his story broke, many people were calling in to the police station claiming that vampires were jumping out in all dark corners of Mineral Point. I don't know if the police chief was a believer or just having fun with the semantics, because he told the newspaper that he had offered overtime for any of his officers to stake out the place, but none of them bit on his offer. I still get reports of people claiming there are vampires in Mineral Point. I've been to the cemetery both day and night many, many times. I've never been attacked by a vampire, but then again, I bring my vampire hunting kit with me whenever I'm in a cemetery with vampire stories. But sometimes we're not certain if it's a legend of a vampire or something else. That's exactly this next case in Minnesota, in Winona, of the Winona vampire or death siren. It all began in the 1920s with the death of this girl, Frances Block. She passed away and was buried in a grave marker out at St. Mary's Cemetery on the outskirts of town. The problem was, after she died, many of her brothers started dying at a young age as well. Her family lived in this house on the east end of Winona in a very superstitious neighborhood. Neighbors told the father that the only way he could save the rest of his family was to go out to the cemetery, dig up his daughter, and chop off her head and bury it separately from the body. The belief in that area at the time was that the first child to die in a family, they acted like a siren or vampire from the grave, enticing their loved ones and their siblings to join them in death. So that's what he did. He went out to the cemetery, dug up his daughter, and when he did, he got cold feet because he did not chop off her head. In fact, he simply placed a cross on her chin and reburied her. The police found out about this action, and they wanted to make sure that he hadn't desecrated the body. It had received a bunch of uproar in the community. So they went out, redug up her body, and sure enough, she hadn't been desecrated. The interesting part was that there was no crime. In the 1920s, apparently in Winona, you could dig up as many people as you wanted as long as you did not harm the bodies. I've been to that cemetery many times. Many of the staff members have ghost stories where they think that death siren is still working from the grave. Here I am over at Loch Ness at one of my expeditions. I'm the one in the blue without the really cool beard. But little did I know, if I wanted to see sea serpents, again, I should have stayed in the Midwest. Well, the Mississippi River, that is. Back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, people were terrified of the Mississippi River. The reason is they believed there were giant monsters living in the river. These huge aquatic beasts were said to be 9 feet long, covered in a thick, scale-like armor that a bullet could not even pierce. And then parents were really afraid of their kids down by the river. They would not allow them down there because they thought there were man-eating fish in the river. The reason being is they would find that many men would drown in the river. And when they pulled these men's bodies out, they discovered a lot of them had deep scratch marks or claw marks on their calves and ankles, as though something grabbed them and pulled them out and drowned them. But then the newspaper said, "Don't worry, it's okay. We've solved the mystery. You can go back to the river. It's nothing more than a couple alligator gars swimming around." Which is all well and good when you don't know what an alligator gar looks like. But when you see that this is a garfish, it's a little different story. Because if a 10-foot garfish swims up against you, you're going to think it's a sea serpent. And in fact, it is. It's just one that we happen to know about. But if you follow the Mississippi River up north a bit, you'll eventually come to a lake on the river, making it an anomaly in itself. Lake Pepin. The earliest tales tell that the first peoples there would only take their strongest and sturdiest canoes out into the water because they believed something bigger and more sinister than an alligator gar resided in the water. Every time they capsized or drowned, they blamed it on this giant beast. When the sea captains brought the riverboats up the Mississippi, they too reported these giant leviathan of the deep. When the pioneers settled the area permanently, they started writing about these stories in their newspapers. Here's one talking about the creature being somewhere between the size of an elephant and a rhinoceros. We have stories in the newspapers dating back to the Civil War about a monster in the lake. The stories have continued decade after decade. Some people believe not only have they seen this monster, some claim photographic evidence of it, including this photograph that was snapped where the witness saw what appeared to be a long neck and a body coming out of the water, while the rest of the body, 30 feet of it, was partially submerged. A few years back, a man was out fishing with his buddy on the lake. They saw what appeared to be a log moving upstream against the current. They thought it was odd, so they motored their boat over there, only to discover it wasn't a log. They snapped this photo of what appears to be a long-necked, hump-like creature, much like you might consider the Loch Ness Monster. I've been on numerous expeditions to Lake Pepin, most recently living on a houseboat for many days and nights with noted researcher Noah Voss. As you can see, we had underwater cameras, we had sonar, we had fishing equipment. We even jumped in using ourselves as bait, but luckily, or maybe unluckily, knock on wood, the creature did not show up. People of Lake City, Minnesota are so convinced that Peppy, the lake monster of Lake Pepin, is real that they are now offering a $50,000 reward for the capture of this monster. As of today, no one has claimed the reward. With the weather we're having this year, you could probably get there this weekend, capture Peppy, and be back $50,000 the richer. But a lot of you are watching this where you don't have to go to Lake Pepin. In fact, for many of you, you don't have to go anywhere. Out of all the Great Lakes, I receive more sea serpents reports from Lake Michigan than all the other Great Lakes, even the much bigger Lake Superior. If you go through the old newspaper archives in the 1800s and early 1900s, you'll see hundreds of reports of people seeing things in the lake. One of my favorite stories tells of construction workers down by the lake. They had their horse and carriage with them. They were doing construction when all of a sudden they saw a gigantic beast rise up out of the water. They immediately went to grab all their tools and weapons to come back. They were going to kill it because they didn't think any of their friends would believe they had just seen a lake monster. They said it was bigger than their horse and carriage combined. But by the time they got back to the water, the creature descended into the water undetected for the rest of the time they were there. Skeptics claim they were simply mistaken, that it was a school of carp, or maybe it was a sea lion from an escaped circus, even though Adam Forepaw's recently departed circus was not missing any of their animals. I'll leave it up to you to dip your toes into Lake Michigan and decide for yourself whether or not there's some giant aquatic monster waiting for you. Out of all the creatures out there, perhaps none is as infamous as that of the Bigfoot. Known throughout the world as the Bigfoot, the Yeti, the Yowie, the Sasquatch, the abominable snowman. Most people, when they think of these creatures, they think of the heavily forested western states. They don't often think of the Midwest. Yet every year we receive dozens of reports from people who have seen something they can't identify. First stop, Southern Illinois, Murfreesboro, the Big Muddy River, named the Big Muddy River because it's a big, muddy river. Stories of the Big Muddy Monster exploded back in 1973 when some lovebirds were enjoying each other parked at the Riverside Park near the river. It was just before midnight when they heard a growl from some creature they had never heard anything like it before. At that moment, a terrible stench came into their vehicle. Then, all of a sudden, they saw what appeared to be a giant Bigfoot-looking creature, 7 to 8 feet tall, 300 plus pounds. It seemed to be coming out of the muddy river. It was caked with mud from the bottom half of it. As it approached the vehicle, they didn't stick around long enough to find out what its intentions were. They hightailed it down to the police station. The police took the report and drove back and searched the area. When they got there, the stench of the creature was still in the air. They also heard a growl. So frightening was the growl that one officer dropped his revolver in the woods. He was so terrified, he refused to go back and get it. It took several hours for him to garner the courage to go back and grab his revolver. They also took footprint photos of something big in the mud. Now, these might not look like your average Bigfoot photos because of the footprints. When you put your foot or anything heavy in the mud, when you pull it up, it creates a suction, leaving a little gash like this in the woods. Many people think that was the beginning of the big muddy monster. But the monster had been moving through the area for many years. Here's a case back in 1949 in Murfreesboro where they were offering a $100 reward for anyone who could capture the monster. Nobody got the reward because no one could even agree what it looked like. Some said it looked like a fox. Others claimed it was a wolf, while still others said it was a bear moving about the area. Seems no wonder they didn't catch it. They couldn't even decide what they were trying to catch. After the 1970s sightings, which there were many of them, people in Murfreesboro began to forget about the monster, began to think it was safe to go outside again. That is until 1988, when Bob Ryman, who owned a junkyard on the outskirts of town, had a very strange encounter at his junkyard. It was the middle of the night when his security officer noticed someone in the back of the junkyard. They had been having trouble with teenagers breaking in and stealing parts and radios. So they both went back about 1:30 a.m. to confront the intruders. All they could see in the back were these glowing red eyes. That's when the smell hit them. Bob told me it was unlike anything he had ever had or smelled in his entire life. Then they saw the creature, giant, 7 feet tall. Bob said its shoulders were at least 3 feet wide. It was moving back and forth, grumbling or talking to itself in a mumble. Bob said it seemed to be speaking some language, but he couldn't decipher it. It was pacing back and forth. His security guard, Charlie, pulled out his revolver and said, "Should I shoot it?" Bob smartly said, "No. We don't know what this thing's capable of. If you shoot it, it might just make it mad." Bob was convinced this thing had glowing red eyes. Not a light shine, not a reflection, but the light was emanating from the creature. They tried to lure the creature back to a motion camera by their shed, but the creature, seemingly showing some intelligence, maneuvered away from their camera. They barricaded themselves in their shed, and when they did, all of a sudden, the creature started banging on the walls of their shed. Bob thought maybe it was throwing boulders or rocks at the building. But Bob told me he didn't think the thing was trying to break in and get them. He thought it could have easily gotten in if it had wanted to. He thought it was trying to scare them. And if it was, it succeeded. They hightailed it out of there. The next day, they found big footprints all over the area from that alleged encounter. But you don't have to take Bob's word for it. You don't have to take my word for it. You can take your own word for it by heading to the Big Muddy River. Probably don't want to swim in the river. You'll come out looking like the Big Muddy Monster. You can also grab my book on the Big Muddy if you'd rather not dip your toes in the Big Muddy River. In Holly, Michigan was one of the weirdest cases I received. It was from a woman who was driving home in her neighborhood one evening. It was late at night. She was taking it slow, didn't want to hit anything or any roadkill. When all of a sudden she looked over at local neighbors' garbage bins. At first, it seemed like some raccoons were rummaging through the garbage bin. But as she almost came to a stop passing by, she realized it was no raccoon. She described it as looking like this. Giant creature tucked up over the garbage cans, huge ears and glowing eyes. It looked rodent-like. She said as she looked at it, it looked back at her and gave her this feeling that she should not be able to see it. And even though she was in the presumed safety of her vehicle, she felt this thing was going to harm her if she did not get out of the area. And that's a very common thing to happen to witnesses. It's almost like they're overcome with an irrational fear, or that they've stepped into a zone of fear, thinking if they don't leave, these monsters are going to harm them. She went home, had the drawing done up of her sighting. She believed the creature was similar to that of the Chupacabra of Central and South America, and now the United States. She thought the goat sucker looked just like the creatures she had seen. It's the first report of a Chupacabra that I've ever received from Michigan. What it was, she had no idea, but she was convinced it was not some known animal. And these kind of creatures are everywhere. In Iowa, one of my favorite legends is a place called Metz Bridge. And not only do you get a monster sighting, you get a little bonus as well. You'll see what I mean. The story tells that many years ago, a man was coming home from the saloon. He was intoxicated, lost control of his vehicle, and drove into the water and drowned. Now the legend tells that when you go there, not only will you see the ghostly image of his vehicle, but many claim they've been chased by the phantom lights. They'll be in the front of them or coming up behind them at a fast pace where they can see it looks like a vehicle. But as soon as it gets close enough to make out who or what it might be, the lights vanish into thin air. But others tell the story that it's not the ghostly vehicle that people fear out there. It's a creature called the Metz Mud Monster. Much like the Big Muddy Monster, a similar creature thought to be coming up from the South Skunk River. As evidenced by the amount of graffiti you see pictured here, people go out to the area for sightings. This creature again is covered halfway up its torso with thick mud all over it. I spoke recently to a gentleman who had been there in the 1980s investigating the legend, when he said him and his buddies saw the mud monster walking on top of the water across the river. Not in the water, above the water on top of it. That was enough for him to get spooked, and they took off from the bridge. But if you think those cases were weird, and granted they were, these next cases are going to be beyond bizarre. The next creature I'm going to tell you about is a creature you might not want to know about. It's certainly a creature that you do not want to say its name, because many cultures believe that merely saying the name of this thing is enough to put you on its radar, that when you go looking for the weird, the weird will come looking for you. Of course, the creature I'm referring to is that of the wendigo, giant cannibalistic monster of the north. It began as a First Nation creature of the people in Canada, and during the harsh Canadian winters and Great Lake winters of the US, in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota, when game was scarce and food was nowhere to be found, people were starving and resorting to cannibalism. That's when the wendigo would show up and attack. The wendigo was said to be somewhere between 8 and 15 feet tall. Giant creature with very thin skeletal-like body. Some say that it had no mouth or lips or tongue because in its insatiable hunt for human flesh, it has consumed its own body. In Minnesota, people who saw the wendigo believed it was a harbinger of death. That if you saw the wendigo, much like hearing the Irish banshee, it meant you or someone you knew was going to die very shortly. One of my favorite places in Minnesota with a wendigo reputation is the aptly named Lake Wendigo, just east of Bemidji. It's a lake on an island in a lake, making it an anomaly in its own right, featured here in a Ripley's Believe It or Not cartoon as the lake within a lake. The island that it sits in is also thought to be haunted. There have been numerous stories about the island, including one story telling of early people going there. The women set up base camp along the shoreline and started cooking. The men went into the woods hunting for game. When they did not return, the women got a bit concerned and went looking for them and found them all hanging from a tree, skinned dead. They left the island, calling it bad medicine, that it was cursed, that they would never step foot on it again. Others, when they went there to retrieve the bodies, no bodies could be found. Others talk about giant holes being found in the ice with enormous footprints coming out leading to the island, as though the wendigo came out of the ice and walked to the island searching for prey. Back in the winter of 2015, I set off on an expedition to Lake Wendigo with my colleagues Noah Voss on your right and Kevin Nelson on your left. You can't tell, but that's me there in the middle. The reason you can't tell is it's about 30 degrees below zero with the wind chill. For several hours, we had to carry our gear on backpack and sled across the ice just to get to the island. I'll give you a taste of what that was like here. You can see that we are all tethered together in case one of us fell through the ice. The other two might be able to pick that person out. We finally got to the island. Many believe the lake is the Wendigo, but in order to explore it, we had to get our base camp going. Noah and I decided we were going to spend the expedition in our frozen tent, but my colleague Kevin over here, he wanted more of an adventure, so he was going to spend his expedition in his hammock out in 30 degree below zero weather. The first thing we had to do is get a fire going, not only for heat and warmth and light, but we had to keep our tallow hot. Tallow is an animal fat, and one of the legends is that you can kill the Wendigo by pouring hot tallow down its throat. It will defrost its icy heart and it will die. Just how you're supposed to pour it down its throat, I'll leave it up to you. But we had our tallow hot the entire expedition. Then we made our way to the lake. As I said, many consider the lake a kettle for the Wendigo. That's where the Wendigo lurks. Many people who summer out on the lake refuse to allow their children to go swimming because the legend is the wendigo will snatch you off of the shoreline and pull you under to your watery grave, and you'll spend eternity in the water with the wendigo. So one night when we had a great base campfire going, Noah and I decided to walk to the middle of the lake and try to conjure up the wendigo. While we were gone, Kevin was tending to base camp. That's where he heard the sound of people talking right at the edge of where he could see. But when he went to look, nobody could be found. He thought it was us. Very unlikely that anyone else was out on that island. But as Noah and I were walking, we were filming it. And Noah paused and said, "Our boots are crunching the snow too loud. Nobody's going to hear what we're talking about. We have to be very quiet." And when we paused, something startled us on a... Let's take a look.
Okay, see, I'm trying to be quiet for... What is it? Don't have it. Don't have eyes or anything.
Let's take another look.
Okay, see, I'm trying to be quiet for... What is it? Don't have it. Don't have eyes.
It's probably a deer or a big bird of prey or an owl or something. We didn't see anything. It's interesting to note that owls are often associated with the wendigo. Some say it's the wendigo shape-shifting into an owl. Others believe the owl is a spy for the wendigo. But although we didn't see anything, I can tell you it got our adrenaline going. So much so that my colleague Kevin slept with his axe right next to his hammock just in case the wendigo appeared. Unfortunately for us, Kevin survived and was not attacked, so I don't have evidence that the wendigo was out there. But if you're going out there, you may want to go in the summertime. You'll have a much more pleasant experience. Or cuddle up with some hot cocoa and grab my Wendigo book from the safety of your non-ice-filled home. This is one of my favorite places in the Midwest. Right outside of my hometown of Eau Claire, Wisconsin, is a small little town called Mary Dean. It was an island named after a young girl by the name of Mary Dean. It was said that she drowned while coming up on a riverboat, and her body was buried in an unmarked grave out on the island. At one time, an entire town lived on this island. The only way to get there was by ferry or boat back and forth. Now it's completely abandoned, a ghost island, maybe literally a ghost island, because many people believe the spirit of Mary Dean acts like a siren in the water where she haunts the spot where she met her end. A lot of these haunted places have dares attached to them. You have to do something in order for the legend to come true. And that's no exception at Mary Dean. It has a wonderful dare. So what is the dare? Well, let's take a look.
I'm here at the boat landing of Mary Dean, where the dare is that if you're foolish enough to go into the water, the vengeful spirit of Mary Dean will try to pull you under, and you'll meet your watery grave and spend eternity in the river with Mary Dean. So I'm going to take this dare right now. No life jacket, no swimming apparel, just me versus Mary Dean. So let's see how this goes.
I know you're all wondering if I survive or not, but it'll get deep and then shallow and then deeper again. You can camp on the island. You don't need to register. You don't need to pay. You just get to camp out there. Those who hear her say she often cries out like a siren saying, "Help me, I can't swim, save me, I'm drowning, don't leave me." And if you're foolish enough to go out there, that'll be your last mistake. Several people have died every year at this spot from drowning. Over the years, I've talked to their friends and family who told me the person was just drawn out there for some unknown reason, and it ended up costing them their life. I'm out here in the middle. So I
So another dare completed.
If you like dares like that, you can go to my website and see me do dozens of them from around the world. You don't have to risk your life. But the story gets even better than just a siren in the water, because it is said that when the island was inhabited, the owner had some dogs, and those dogs mauled some children and had to be put down, the dogs. And now the legend tells that when you go out there and park your car at the boat landing, you will see what many people are calling the hellhounds of Mary Dean. These are large black dogs with glowing red eyes. They've been reported throughout history in nearly every culture on the planet. Many believe they do the devil's bidding, that they guard portals to hell. But just to show you we're not the only weird people to believe in these creatures, a few years ago I was over in Central America. I was over in the jungles looking for a jungle protector that they called the Tata Duende. Everywhere I went looking for this diminutive, backward-footed creature, villagers said, you better get back here before nightfall, because if you don't get back here before the sun goes down, you might encounter our hellhounds. They called them cadeos. They believed these things had supernatural powers, that if they saw you, they would connect with you and slowly start to steal your energy. And unless you could find a powerful shaman or a bush doctor to remove the curse, you'd be dead within a week of seeing these monsters. So being the researchers that we were, we made it a point to stay out past dark every night. And luckily, knock on wood, I'm still here today. But back to the boat landing of Mary Dean. After one of my programs, a big burly biker guy came up to me. You know, the type of guy you wouldn't think would get spooked by anything? Told me him and his buddies took their motorcycles out there one night to see the ghost of Mary Dean. They had never heard of the hellhound legend. But as soon as they got there, he felt they were surrounded by hellhounds. When I asked him why he thought they were hellhounds and not just wild black dogs, he told me three things stood out. One, they were nearly transparent. He could almost see right through them. Two, they had glowing red eyes emanating from the creature itself. And three, no matter how fast they went on their motorcycles, these dogs could keep up with them. It wasn't until he went to kick it and his big biker boot went right through it that the dog finally disappeared. I'll leave it up to you to venture to Mary Dean and see if they are really guarding a portal to hell. But if hellhounds are not your thing, I recommend you head to the Sacred National Monument in Pipestone, Minnesota, home where many cultures quarry to get their stone that they use in their ceremonial pipes. When I first went there, I was staying at the haunted Calumet Inn Hotel in downtown. They believe it's haunted by several spirits, including an old flapper girl that used to work there when she was a lady of the night, when it was more of a brothel than a hotel. Others claim it's haunted by a man who met his end in one of the numerous fires to plague the hotel. But everywhere we went in town, villagers said you need to get out to the monument because they believed it was haunted. Those walking down the trail would often hear the ghostly singing of a woman, thinking maybe she was someone there participating in a ceremony. People would try to follow the voice, but they could never find the origin of it. Others would see the ghostly image of a native-looking man dressed in full native regalia. But they also believed the creatures were out there that shouldn't be there, but yet there they were. They were, of course, these creatures. straight out of folklore, 3.5 feet tall, pointed ears, pointed cap, what you might consider a gnome, a fairy, a goblin, a troll, the hidden people, the sprites, the good folks. You know, something straight out of folklore. Now, when I was over in Ireland, I'd walk into a pub and say, where do all the gnomes and fairies hang out? And they'd say, which ones do you want to know about? But you see over there, they believed these things had supernatural powers. They could take your sight, your hearing, or your life as they lulled you to sleep, and you'd be fairy led to their realm. So they believed that if you go looking for these creatures, you need to bring an offering with you, whether it's some tobacco, a shiny rock, some candy, something to appease the spirits. So when I first went to the Pipestone Sacred Monument, I looked for a spot where I said, if little people exist, this looks like a great place for them to be. So I sat down under a tree and I put out my bait, my offering, and I called out for the little people to make themselves known. 15 minutes went by, nothing happened. Then it felt like something fell out of the tree into my hair, an acorn or a branch, but nothing was there. 15 minutes later, the same thing happened. Then, as I sat there on a beautiful sunny afternoon, I immediately felt very drowsy, to the point where I said, if I don't get up and move around, I'm going to fall asleep. So I walked back to the visitor center, and immediately I started talking with some of the stone carvers there. They're the cultural ambassadors answering questions. I spoke with one woman who had been there 20 plus years, her mother many more years. She said oftentimes they would hear the pipes rattling in a back locked room, but when they'd go back and turn on the lights, they'd see the little people scattering all over. She said the most common thing that would happen to her and her mother is they'd be carving when all of a sudden it felt like someone or something landed in their hair like a fly. But nothing was there. They felt it was the little people tugging on their hair in a playful manner. Perhaps the same thing that happened to me under the tree. As I left, she said, whatever you do, do not call out for the little people because they will make themselves known. I didn't have the heart to tell her I was just calling out for them, but luckily I'm still here today. Of course, we could not talk about creatures, especially around Halloween time, without bringing up the legend of werewolves and dogmen. Thanks to my good friend and colleague Linda Godfrey, my home state of Wisconsin is now known as the werewolf capital of the world. It all began as Linda was working as a journalist. She started receiving reports of people traveling down a small stretch of road called Bray Road. There, usually at night, but not always, people would see what appeared to be, for a lack of a better term, a werewolf-type creature. Often it was the size of a bear, but shaped more like a wolf with this long muzzle and the deep, dark, matted down fur. Many would see it on the side of the road, eating roadkill or freshly killed prey. What scared many witnesses is that they reported it was a biped running upright on its hind legs like you and I do. They called it a werewolf, but the name sometimes gets changed quite a bit depending on the creature. Up in the Northwoods of Michigan and all over the state, people have dogman sightings. In the Omar Plains area, these stories date back many generations. And they talk that if you go out into the wooded area, you will see what they are calling the witchy wolves, these part dog, part wolf-like creatures. Again, very large, huge fangs, matted, stranded up fur all over its body. When I was up there investigating the dogmen of Michigan, I spoke with a gentleman who had been there his whole life. He was up there in age. He told me back in the 1950s, the land was a great Lovers Lane area where people would go out with their significant other, the one they were courting. And he said many times people would come back claiming that their clothing was ripped to shreds by these giant dogmen-like creature, which, of course, if you're out on Lover's Lane and you can come back with ripped clothing, it's a nice excuse to have that it was actually the dogman trying to tear you apart. But in that area, they feared that these creatures would attack them. That if you went out, that these creatures were some sort of protective spirit, maybe even placed there from a curse of the area, meant to keep people out. And the dogman's been seen all over Michigan. Again, these giant dog-like creatures. But the question then becomes, where did they go? What are they? Were they ever there in the first place? And were they ever flesh and blood? We have other stories of it as well. Outside of Fort Dodge in Iowa, they have a place called Terra Bridge. Except the locals, they call it Terror Bridge because it's thought to be haunted by an old railroad worker who lost his life doing pile driving of hitting spikes into the ground, and one came out and decapitated him. Others tell of a distraught young woman who snapped, went psychotic, and brought her kids out to the train track and waited. Eventually, she threw them over to the oncoming train and then jumped over and joined them in death as well. Now the legend tells that when you go there, not only will you see the ghostly images of the kids, but many claim that if you park on the bridge and do not lock your doors and windows, the spirit of that murdering mother will try to throw you to your death. Last time I was there, I was down below the bridge. Up above were Noah and Kevin again. Not only did they not lock their doors and windows, they came over to the side, hoping that she would try to throw them over. I was down below filming, praying that she would throw them to their deaths, but unfortunately, she did not make an appearance. But around the same time period as the stories began about the bridge being haunted, many people claim that they'd be driving down the road, first in horse and buggy, and then in their vehicle, when they'd see a similar looking creature as to the Michigan Dogman or the Beast of Bray Road. Running upright on its hind legs, they were amazed to find it was a biped. One woman recently told me she saw this creature. They tried to get away from it in their vehicle, hitting 55 miles per hour on the dirt road, only to look over and find that the creature was right next to them as though it wasn't even trying to run at all. But the good news is that outside of charging at a couple vehicles, these creatures seem to be just as afraid of witnesses as witnesses are of them. And rather than attack most people, they seem content to scurry back into the underbrush undetected. So if you go looking for these creatures, most likely you won't be killed. Well, 50-50. Do so at your own risk. But as I'm running low on time, I want to end with this last bit of caution. Most of the people that contact me about a sighting of a monster, they're not out actively looking for it. It happens by chance. Many times when people are out driving, they see something they simply can't explain, often on the side of the road at night, and they're scared because they have no idea what they had just seen. So I want all of you to keep that in mind as the next time you go driving out looking, that maybe something is looking back at you. So if you want more information, I hope your adventure doesn't end here with this program. Go on your own adventure of the Midwest. And when you do, I think you'll discover that we live in one heck of a weird area. And I mean that in a good way. You're going to see things you've never seen. You'll meet some odd people. And along the way, you might just discover that the scariest thing out there is often yourself. So with that, if you want more information, you can go to my website, get more information than you'd ever want or need. But I really want to thank the library for putting this together. It's very rare you can come to a program like this at no cost, check out a wealth of information. So if you like programs like this, let them know so you get more of these. If you didn't like today's program, let them know so you get fewer of these. But either way, I can't think of a time in history when the library has played such an important role as it does today. With everything going on with the pandemic, societal issues, politics, libraries are that fabric that keep our communities together. They're a real treasure for any city that has one. So in my appreciation, if you want to go to my website and grab any of my books, just type in the coupon code library and you'll save 20% off of any of my books. So with that, if you have any questions, put them in the chat room and I'll turn it over to the library and we'll save some time for questions, comments, or stories from any of you.
Thank you so much. We can't see you, but we can just see your name again. There, perfect.
I'm alive. I'm a real non-ghost.
Yes, you are. Thank you. Thank you for the plug for the library. That's fantastic. We love library supporters for sure. Does anyone out there have any questions? I was looking for the raise hand feature and I don't see it on here. So you can type it in chat if you'd like, or even in the questions and answers, and I can unmute you and you can talk out loud if anyone has any questions.
And keep in mind that this is just the tip of the iceberg. You can't throw a rock in the Midwest without hitting a legend of some weird creature. Just in Wisconsin alone, I've tracked down over 40 different lakes, rivers, and streams that were thought to have had or have a lake monster in them. And that's just in my state. I mean, these stories are everywhere.
You see, Stephen asked, what's your next expedition?
Yes, I'm doing, well, with COVID, it's a little challenging, but luckily my next book is on supernatural dares of places where you have to do things. If you knock 3 times on a mausoleum, a demon will show up. And luckily, a lot of these places are very rural and secluded. So I can go out there on my own and not have to worry about running into anybody, at least not anyone who's alive.
Interesting. Here's an optional question from our friend Kim. What book are you reading right now?
Book I'm reading right now is David Weatherly's Cryptids of Indiana. And David Weatherly has written several books on creatures of the United States. And I love it because he contains and combines old stories of legends you've never heard of with legends that are happening to this very day. So you get a chance to go out and explore if that's your macabre sense of adventure.
Sweet. What do you take with you when you go exploring for mysteries? What's in your go bag?
I used to bring a lot more equipment than I do today, mainly because I felt all the time I was spending so much time putting this equipment together, monitoring it, and then breaking it down, that I was missing out on the legend, that I wasn't experiencing it and having fun. So most of the time I'm out there with a camera and a notebook, maybe an audio recorder, maybe some trail cams, some motion detectors, but nothing replaces common sense and curiosity. So some people see all these TV shows where they have all the equipment and they don't want to spend $20,000 on equipment. So they're dissuaded from going on these places and investigating, where I think some of the best equipment you can have is a notebook. I mean, I joke about it, but I've interviewed witnesses, I've written down directions, started campfires with it. So don't let that dissuade you from going out.
So Kathleen said, so besides the something on your head, have you personally experienced anything odd?
Usually when I go to these places, nothing happens, knock on wood. Sometimes I may bring psychics with me who claim they've been pinched or pushed by spirits at these places, but oftentimes it's nothing that is physically scary. It's more of a psychological scare that even if you don't believe in dogmen, when you're walking around Michigan at night, at midnight by yourself, and you hear a twig breaking in the distance, I mean, when I'm in Michigan doing that, I'm calling my colleague Steve Ward for a rescue because, you know, your mind just conjures up images of these things. And people often ask, do I ever get scared at these places? And I'm always saying, if you're going to these places and you're not getting scared, you're not trying hard enough, because they're just downright creepy, even if you don't believe the legends.
Oh yeah, I think tomorrow night with Blue Moon being out, there's going to be a lot of freaky people and people freaked out.
And this close to Halloween, many believe that the veil between worlds is at its thinnest, allowing different worlds a peek into our world, which also then means we get to peek into their world, hopefully not too deep though.
Right, exactly. What is there any one particular project that you're working on? Is that like, are you writing a book right now?
I've got a few projects going. The problem with October is I'm doing so many lectures and media that it's hard to, especially this year with COVID, doing them virtually, where previous years I would travel a bit and I would collect research as I was traveling, so that when I was at a library or a university, I would be doing legends during the day, and then after the program, trying dares in the area too. So yeah, I'm always got a few projects, but my newest one, Wendigo lore, is coming into the winter. And as you heard from this program, that's a creature you do not want to encounter.
There's another question here, and as you answer that, I'm going to go get our friend so he can pull our name from the drawing for the free t-shirt. But Stephen asked, can you explain the elusiveness of some of the creatures? Why do so many people see them, but we can't prove their existence?
Yes, why do we not have the bodies of these things? Why do we not have more evidence, some droppings, some fur, conclusive evidence that if these things are here, and they're here in the flesh and blood manner in which we think they might be here, much like an elephant or a bear, where are they? Especially sometimes when there are decades between sightings of these things. Where do they go? Where do they hide? Were they ever there? I don't know. And that's one of the most frustrating aspects of this research, is so many questions, more questions than answers, that they should be there. Sea serpents, some of the lakes in which they were spotted would be very hard for something bigger than a sturgeon to live in, much less these giant 40-foot monsters. So the question then becomes, where'd they go? Are they there at all? And that happens with a lot of these monsters. So I think you'll want to stick around. The shirt's really cool that they're drawing for.
Yes, so we'll draw the winner right now. And what? That was an empty one. Hold on.
A ghost.
It was. Oh, Paisley Carpenter. So I will get a hold of Paisley, and I want to thank you so very much for joining us today. I hope you have wonderful time on your next adventures, and you'll be back sometime, maybe even in person someday, to let us know more.
Thank you, and keep an eye out.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.